Hello, and welcome to the Kings Weekly podcast, part of the Believe Network, the Basketball Intelligence Network, and the Old Man Squad Network. I am your co-host, Nick Agar-Johnson, editor-in-chief and staff writer for No Ceilings NBA, and we are honored to be joined by our special guest today. But first of all, I do have to introduce my co-host, the founder and curator of the Basketball Intelligence newsletter, available at basketballintelligence.net, Ray LeBeau. Hello there, Ray.
Hello, Nick. And indeed, we have a special guest today, as we're going to be reviewing the Kings draft of the last couple of years. Just say preliminarily that for all the things that people are frustrated with the Kings among our listeners, the draft is not one of them, or two of them if we take 2 years. They've been actually doing quite a good job. And this last draft built on what they did last year. So our special guest, who thankfully needs no introduction, but I'm going to give him one anyway, because all of you are likely very familiar with him, is Fran Fraschilla, who, wow, where do I start? 3 different schools, head coach for D1, multiple others as assistant coaches. Was involved in coaching, I think it was 18 players that made it to the NBA. I won't recite the names because it would take all of our show. It's been with ESPN for quite some time, and many of you likely know him as, I don't know, the ultimate draft guru. But anyway, that's... So our treat today is that we have Fran and Nick, and I'll chime in as appropriate, but mostly these two draft experts to talk to us about last year's draft, this year's draft, and a few other related things. So I think I've gone on too long already. So thanks for joining us, Fran.
It's a pleasure, Ray. Always love talking hoop with you, whether we do it on here or on a phone conversation, which... as we joked about earlier, Nick, Ray and I are old enough to go back many, many, many years. I guess you'd say we're two basketball history junkies, as well as being up to date on modern times. So we'll leave it there. But I certainly
enjoyed not mentioning that I saw my first NBA game in 1954.
Oh, my goodness. Now, I can't say the same, but wonderful. Anyway. Let's get started. I'm ready to go. Wherever you guys want to take this.
I think a good place to start will be with Acuff. Tell us, what your observations are and what your expectations are. And I know you saw him both in college and in summer league, and then Nick as well. So let's start with you to talk to us about Acuff.
Well, I've been watching Darius. Probably, I live in Colorado Springs, so. All of the USA basketball under 19, under 17, under 16 teams, they come here for their practices and their trials. So, I've seen Darius a number of times before he got to Arkansas with Coach Cal, and I've always been a fan. I compared him in his younger days and maybe even now as he heads to the league, kind of like Damian Lillard, and I'll tell you why. Having been in college coaching for so long, the kids from LA, from Chicago, from New York, maybe Washington, D.C., they got a lot of attention in high school on the circuit. The kids from Baltimore, Detroit, St. Louis, Oakland, are rough and tumble places which have produced their own incredible basketball players. So Darius coming from Detroit, that's why he kind of reminds me of Dame Lillard, that Oakland, Detroit toughness, a junkyard dog, if you will. And so I was very high on him coming into college. I actually saw one of his worst games last year when they lost to Kentucky at home. I did the game in person, and it wasn't that he played poorly. It's just that in the first half, he probably took 9 shots, and 8 of them, Nick, went in and out. They were right on the rim and out. He was getting really frustrated. And I'm thinking to myself, an old scout, Herb Livesey, who just retired from the Nuggets this year at 91, when I would sit with Herb, he was a great junior college coach in California, Ray. I don't know if you ever ran into Herb, but Herb used to say, you could tell a good shooter because even when they don't go in, they're inside the rim. And that night, that was Darius. So, but Darius obviously has a proclivity for scoring. But the thing that impressed me that I think Kings fans are going to love is he's got tremendous pick and roll IQ. He's really going to make people around him better. And in fact, with Domas in that short roll situation where he's been one of the best in the league at that, I see those two guys really hooking up and then having Domas spread the ball around. But a big fan. I know he had his ups and downs in summer league. Not worried about that at all. I think he's going to have a really good rookie year. In fact, this is a crazy statement. I've told people that I think he's going to have a 40-point night this year in the league. I do. I think there's going to be a night where everything's clicking. He's making 7 or 8 threes, scoring in transition, and you're going to go, "Wow, how did he do that?" And so that's my take on him, Nick. I'm really excited to watch him play this year.
Yeah, it's really interesting to me that you brought up that Kentucky game because I had a very similar experience watching his first game in California Classic Summer League, where, the first quarter of that game, he was settling for a lot of shots. He didn't look himself in a lot of ways. And the second quarter started, and instead of settling, he started attacking the basket a lot more. And suddenly things started looking a lot better. And by the time the second half started, he was throwing I think he's probably the best lob passer in his class. And so he was throwing lobs all over the place. He was getting other players involved. And, he ended up passing to Nique Clifford for what ended up being the game-winning 3. And it was one of those things where that first quarter was very concerning. But the part that, stood out to me the most in the positive way was, okay, what does his process look like, right? And so it was one of those things where, all right, this isn't working. And rather than just continuing to hammer and hammer and hammer and, take a whole bunch of step back threes and hope that they start going in, it's like, okay, I'm going to switch it up. I'm going to start attacking a little bit more off ball. I'm going to try to get downhill towards the rim and see if that can open up the rest of my game. And especially when you're talking about summer league, I think process is by far the most important thing to be looking out for. And, even though some of the final lines in terms of his shooting percentages didn't look great, I was really pleased with the process he showed in that and a few of his other summer league games. But that game in particular, the first half was so different from the second half in a way that I thought was really encouraging.
Yeah, and I honestly, I call the summer league the AA All-Star game in baseball. Because that's where all the best prospects are. Usually in AA before they get to AAA. They're, in fact, a lot of times AAA anymore in baseball, as you guys may know, it's players going up and down from the majors, but the best prospects are in AA. So in summer league, Nick and Ray, I don't get too concerned if I've seen somebody enough. And there's no question in my mind he's going to shoot the ball well. He did in college. In terms of process, Nick, I like what you said because one of the ways I judge young guards coming into the league, I'm a pick and roll fanatic. I teach it. I love watching it. I study it. And, the average fan thinks pick and roll is 2-on-2, but really pick and roll is how do we destroy the other 3 help defenders? Can you make the cross court hook pass to the other corner where Malik Monk's waiting there for the ball? Ty Halliburton did this as a college freshman, and he's carried that over. And Darius has that pick and roll IQ that I think you need to have in the league because of how good the defenses are. To your point, there are going to be some lob catches at the rim by Dylan Cardwell and maybe Keegan Murray, some of these other guys. But he sees the floor and he sees all 5 defenders, and I think that's a good sign. And, I have no question in my mind that he's going to not only have a good rookie year, but he may have a great rookie year because he's really the only, as I look at that roster, it's really the only pure point guard on that roster. I still see Monk as a combo guard, but he's going to have the ball in his hands, in my mind, 32 minutes a night as a rookie.
So this is all very encouraging. And I think that, and Kings fans obviously are looking for anything that's encouraging, but it definitely is. But one thing I wanted to ask you, and that significant criticism that he's been
the defense
getting as a defense. What's your take on that?
I was watching Jacoby Walter from Toronto, and we were talking about this off the air. And Jacoby only played 1 year in college and wasn't thought to be an okay defender, good athlete, potential 3-and-D guy. And I'm watching him, and the transformation from college to the NBA was striking. But when you look at these kids coming into college, into the NBA, they're not told to guard hard in college because the coach doesn't want them in foul trouble. Like Coach Cal doesn't want Darius Acuff Jr. playing 16 minutes because he picked up 2 fouls in the first half, and in some cases picked up 3. because some coaches will play you in college with three. So I'm not worried about that, Ray. He's not going to be an over the top great defender, but he's got that bulldog toughness that I think when he puts his mind to it and he's coached. Okay, now I mentioned Jacoby Walter. That guy in Toronto, Rajakovic, is a tremendous basketball coach, and they were top five in defense in the league last year with Scotty Barnes, who I think is going to be on the Olympic team, and others. So, in a tangential way, I'm telling you, I wouldn't worry about it just yet. That can be taught. He's got the athleticism and the toughness to become at least an average defender. So he's not hurting the team.
And just in terms of the summer league stuff, there were some off-ball things that sort of made their way around the internet, but a lot of the on-ball stuff looked a lot better than it did at Arkansas. And I think that speaks to exactly what you were just saying of, okay, rather than just my role being I've got to be the offensive engine who doesn't get in foul trouble, it's like I have to actually man up and guard my guy. And, he was doing that at summer league and at a degree that was certainly encouraging. And, some of the off-ball stuff wasn't great, but also that is the kind of stuff that can be taught.
That's why they pay those coaches big money in the NBA, And the other thing too is, I think the kid's got that Detroit toughness where, he's not going to want Jamal Murray to get 45 on him. You know what I mean? And he can. I mean, he can get 45 on most people, but I think he's got that pride factor that he'll be fine once he figures out how to guard some of these great guards. And we all know this, that league is full of guards that you're just not stopping on a given night anyway. But if you can slow somebody down and hold them to 20, or to your point earlier, Nick, a guy goes, 5 for 16, you've kind of done your job that night.
So the other first rounder that the Kings took was Karaban. And he got off to a kind of a shaky start in summer league, but he was coming off an ankle injury. And so, I don't think he should be judged by that, but I'm going to leave it to you guys to talk about what you think he brings and what you think.
Well, Nick, you start it. You go ahead and start it, and I'll follow up.
Yeah, so where I was at with Karaban was essentially that, it's a very difficult question to gauge of when you draft for fit versus, who's the best player available. But Karaban checked so many of the boxes that the Kings desperately needed checked, of a forward with size, someone with winning pedigree, someone who is a connective passer, and someone who, joining the team that was 30th in three-point percentage and 29th in attempts last year, a real legitimate three-point threat. And, that first game of Summer League was concerning because the flip side of the Alex Karaban story is the biggest concern I had was, is he going to be able to adjust to NBA level athleticism? And, he has very stiff hips, which is a real problem in terms of on-ball stuff. But, the performances after he, started to recover from that ankle injury looked a lot better, and he looked a lot closer to an NBA athlete as opposed to someone who, showed some concerning stuff athleticism wise in that first game. So I wasn't particularly worried heading in, just in the sense of, he's coming back from an injury, maybe a bit too early just to get out there on the court in Vegas and show something. But in theory, he fits very, very neatly into the Kings roster construction. He's not someone who's going to be demanding the ball a lot, right? So Darius Acuff Jr. will get the chances to work out the offense. He's going to be the three-point shooter that he's going to be kicking out to. And I don't know, I feel like the pick made a whole lot of sense, and I'm not taking all that much away from the Summer League stuff. He also had a 21-point game, right? And that got talked about a lot less than the miserable 0.2 rebound, 1 assist effort in his opener in Summer League. So I'm pretty much in the same place with Karaban as I was heading into Summer League, but I'm curious what your thoughts are.
Well, I think where you picked him, where you pick him in the later part of the first round, and knowing that you're looking to put together a roster of guys that are, winning players, he's a good fit. And, I always tell the college kids when I get to speak to them during the season, like, do you know what you call an NBA role player? And they look at me and I say, a multimillionaire. Because there's only 25 stars in the league. Everybody else is a role player. I mean, Clint Capella makes $25 million. He's a role player. Christian Brown it may be overpaid right now in Denver at 25 million for 5 years. I think he signed for, and he's a role player. And Alex Karaban is your classic role player. I've watched him play since high school. I know that area well because I grew up in the Northeast. But to your point, Nick, winning culture, going to be around good players, so he's going to be more open than even he was in college. And I have confidence that he'll stick threes and then compete on the defensive end. He's not a super athlete, to your point. He's not quite as mobile as Jaime Jaquez, but he's got the same kind of winning DNA that Jaime brought from UCLA, being a Final Four player. And again, where you're taking him in the late part of this first round, I think he's just what the doctor ordered. Now, was there more? Were there some guys with more upside? Sure. You're talking about a 23-year-old, I believe. And in this case, I think he's a good fit. I really do. I don't expect him to be a star in the NBA. I expect him to be in the league 10 years. And I'm trying to think. We were talking about Tim Legler earlier, who had a solid career. This guy will not be Kyle Korver, but there's guys in the league like that know their role, compete on the defensive end, space the floor, make open shots. And the other thing is he's going to be no maintenance at all in the locker room, which matters in that league. And, as Yubi would say, in our league. Come on, we all know this, okay? In our league, okay? But, yeah, I like Alex. I think he's a great fit for what they drafted him for.
Yeah, and that I think is the key in the sense of, maybe there are players with potentially higher ceilings, but if they don't have a way to get on the floor, they're not helping you, right? Whereas with Karaban, it's everything that he does well is something that the Kings desperately needed last year, and he should provide that right away. And, the flip side of the fact that he's already 23 is, well, he's going to hit restricted free agency, and then you can basically lock him up for his entire prime if it works out, right? So, there is the element of, oh, he's just 19, he's going to get better. But there's also the element of there are going to be players who were drafted at 19 who at 23 are not as good as Alex Karaban is right now.
Well, and let's add to that. Let's add to that and say, I think it's pretty obvious he played in a lot of big games.
Yes.
You know what I mean? And he played in front of 70,000, 9 times, I think, like 2 semis and finals. I mean, this guy has been in big games, pressure games where he had to make the shots for UConn, and many times he did, as you guys know. So he's not going to be a wallflower. He's again getting back to what he does. He's a role player. He'll compete on the defensive end, and if he's making shots at 37% from deep, he's going to be very valuable, to the Kings.
And that was something else that I heard quite a bit coming out of his workouts of, people being impressed with how much of a leader he was in a workout setting. I don't think I've heard that about anybody before. And so,
you got no choice when you play for Dan Hurley. Trust me. So you learned a little leadership from Dan and how to do things the right way, how to compete the right way. Let's put it that way.
So a second round pick that surprised a lot of people. And
my favorite.
Yes, but just in terms of how exciting and how wonderfully he performed in the Summer League was Emanuel Sharp. And love to hear what you have to say about him because Kings fans are very excited about it.
I probably know the Houston program as well as I know any program in the country. Kelvin, Sampson, and I go back 31 years. We actually upset them in the NCAA tournament in his first year at Oklahoma when I was the young coach at Manhattan College. We were a 13 seed. We've been friends ever since. And then when I went to the Big 12 as an announcer in 2003, he was, as you guys know, the coach of Oklahoma, where my son later played, who's now with the Washington Wizards as an assistant. So I've known Kelvin really well. When you play at Houston, it's the basketball equivalent of Navy SEALs. Okay? You're basically joining Navy SEALs. And the interesting background, and you guys probably have talked about this during the summer, but in case your listeners don't know, this young man had a compound fracture in his leg after his junior year. Kelvin Sampson still offered him a scholarship, so he didn't play the first part of his senior year, and then he enrolled at Houston early in order to rehab and redshirted that freshman year, and then obviously had 4 more outstanding seasons. Dad was a great player in Europe. Derek Sharp is one of the beloved figures at Maccabi Tel Aviv, one of the great programs in Europe. Emanuel, as you may know, is Israeli and American, can play for the Israeli national team, but competitiveness. Um, Before we talk about the shooting, it's the competitiveness. He comes out of a program where he had to work hard every single day. He's not a great athlete, but he's made himself into a really good defender, both on ball and off. Um, and then the shooting and the deep range and the big shots. And ironically, when I say big shots, we all remember that he had the ball in his hands on the final play of the national championship game his junior year, which hopefully he's gotten over by now. But the big shots, time after time throughout his career, and also the way he got better, and great second round pick. I think the Kings. We're all hoping here in this little triangle that we've got here talking about the Kings that the Kings have found a steal in the second round, Nick. So I'd be curious to see what you think.
So I actually want to go back to something you said about Kelvin Sampson, which to me was, I was incredibly impressed with Chris Jr. deciding to play for the Houston Cougars, because to me that said, this is a young man who doesn't care about how miserable the experience is going to be. He only cares about getting better and learning how to play basketball the right way and, improve himself in that way. And it's like, that's not something you see every day from a guy who was top 6 in his high school class. Right. And, with Sharp, obviously it's a slightly different calculus because he wasn't that, top 10 high school prospect, but
let me interrupt. He's a 3-star. Chris and Fleming's were 5 stars. And interesting, before you go on, because I really want to hear what you have to say, I thought Chris Sinak, that was a joke that he slid that far. I'm a huge Chris Sinak fan. I saw him practice. I think the Celtics got a steal. And then Kingston Flemings could have gone anywhere, and he chose to join Navy SEALs. So I'm right on. You're right on. I've said that maybe 100 times this year on broadcasts about Chris. But you're right about him and Kelvin. I interrupted you, so fire away.
No, I mean, I loved Kingston Flemings in the draft, and I was a bit surprised that he was, one of the later point guards of that point guard group taken, but I digress. Going back to Sharp, I think that was the, first thing that I think stood out to Kings fans of this guy's guarding 94 feet in Summer League. And, that first game of Summer League that I mentioned earlier with Acuff, where he just couldn't buy a bucket in that first quarter, the Kings scored 10 points in that first quarter. And then in the second quarter, Emanuel Sharp hits a 3, gets a steal, hits another 3, and suddenly the Kings are in that game. And, it was a game they ended up winning. And for all that wins in Summer League matter, right, it was one of those moments where it's like, okay, even in an environment like this, he is going to be working harder than anybody else on the court. And with the athleticism stuff, it's interesting because, he's not the quickest athlete. He doesn't have the greatest vertical leap, but I think strength is a really underrated part of the athleticism discussion. And Emanuel Sharp is built like a fire hydrant, right? Like he might be 6'3", but he's not someone who's going to get pushed around by NBA level players because he's going to be bigger than quite a few of the guys that he's guarding. And, it's one of those things where I always just imagine in my mind the images of 6'4" Marcus Smart not getting backed down by centers who are trying to post him up. And, it's not quite to that level with Sharp, but it's a similar kind of deal where I'm much less concerned about him guarding up the lineup than I would a normal 6'3" player just because of that strength that he has. And then, you mentioned the shooting. I mean, range 30 feet plus, one of the best free throw shooters in college. He shot 89% at the free throw line last year, which another huge indicator of touch that I think goes underrated in the discussion.
And I think
of these sorts of things.
I think 87% for his career, if I'm not mistaken.
I believe that's correct. Yeah.
Yeah, it sticks out. 87% over 4 years.
Yeah.
So
no, it's.
So
go ahead.
How do you see him being used by the Kings, given all the things that we've just been talking about?
Well, the one thing about the Kings, when you come into the season, they do have depth in the backcourt, and depending on what they do as far as their roster, I know they think they have still one or two more spots. I think they got 13 now, right? Is it 13 guaranteed?
I believe so, yeah.
Well, they got a chance to add somebody, but they're deep in the backcourt, assuming they keep Zach LaVine and, you got the jack of all trades, Nique Clifford and Malik Monk, and now a young guard. So I think Emmanuel's going to find his way on the court. It's a long season, 82 games. It's funny because, as you know, Ray, being a draft junkie that I am, it's not so much that, I don't mean to disparage draft experts. I don't necessarily consider myself one, but, we all know who the top 10 are by the time you get to June 1st. But it's the late first, early second. Like TJ McConnell doesn't get drafted. Javon Carter, I think went in the second round. I saw him for 4 years. Jamal Shed. I mean, I told my NBA scouting friends, who I know pretty much everybody in the league, like in January, I said, you're not cutting this guy. I know he's 6'1", he's a point guard, and he's small. You're not cutting this guy. Oh, Jose Alvarado, you're not cutting him. You know, he just got another 3-year deal with the Knicks. And again, Nick, I think that's that's Emmanuel Sharp, except that he's bigger than those guys and he's a better shooter. And so you're not cutting Emmanuel Sharp when you draft him.
Did it surprise
the coaches
him slide as much as he did?
What's that? No, I think he went in the right place because I mean, if somebody would have taken him earlier, I wouldn't have been like bent out of shape. But getting back to what we said about Karaban, some people like the fact that he's got the production. Others are going to take projection. And in this case, the production guys, most of them actually go in the second round because the projection guys are all the top 10 or 15 picks. The guys you hope are going to be really, really good NBA players. So I wasn't surprised he went in the middle of the second round. And but I'm very high on Emmanuel. By the way, there's no maintenance with him. I mean, he's all business. I mean, the way he was raised by mom and dad and coming out of Houston, he's a pro right now.
Well, he certainly impressed everybody with his play in summer league. Everyone that I've talked to, and plus my own eyes, it's like, wow, that was he really delivered. So this was the second year in a row that the Kings have done well in the draft plus undrafted. And the rookies from last year did quite well in league play. And again, in some instances, were taken much later than how they actually produced during the season.
Yeah.
And so let's talk about those players and what your observations were last year, but also how that turned out. And we can start with Raynaud, who it was taken at 42.
Yes. But I would say I was really high on both big men. Now, someone might say, oh, yeah, sure. Yeah. Was Dylan Cardwell even drafted?
No.
Okay. So, someone would say, yeah, Fran, yeah, now great. They played their rookie year, and now you're telling me they're good. No, I had Auburn like 4 times his senior year. I saw them beat Houston in Houston, by the way. And the thing that jumped out at me about Dylan, first of all, I got to talk to him, got to know him. Coach Pearl and the staff I know very, very well. And when I saw Dylan Cardwell, I think I said Cardwell, and got to know him, my first reaction is, oh my God, 12-year NBA backup center, which someone would say, oh, you don't think he's going to be a good player? No. 12 years in the NBA as a backup center, he's going to make at minimum $80 million. Okay? So that's okay. Now, is he going to be better than that after averaging almost 8 rebounds a game last year? Maybe. But what I loved about him was he knows his role. He knows the effort he has to play with every night. He does certain things really well, which is rebound the ball. He's actually, when I remember him in college, a reasonably good ball mover. I think, like Nick said it best about Karaban, he's a connective passer. He's not going to hold on to the ball. He's not going to be shooting a lot of threes. He knows who he is. And that's the ultimate example of a guy that can stay in the league a long time because he is who he is. And by the way, the other thing that really jumped out at me when he was at Auburn is, holy crap, for 6'11" or 7 feet, he's a really good athlete. I mean, he's a good athlete for his size, and he moves his feet, and he was hard coached. So that's Dylan. I saw Max play in the NIT, probably the last game. Well, it wasn't the last game of his senior year or whatever it was, his junior year or whatever it was. I think he came out after his junior year, maybe. I'm not sure. But I know he came out early, I think. But what I was impressed with Max is the fact that he hadn't played a lot of basketball, and that for being 7'1", I thought he was really skilled. And I have some friends who coached him at Stanford, and then they left Stanford. And when I called them before the draft, and a couple of people in the what was it last year? He was in the ACC even 2 years ago. Second best player in the ACC behind Cooper Flagg. I had a couple of ACC coaches tell me that. And if you go back and look at the ACC 2 years ago, he probably ended up producing as well as anybody who came out of the league other than Cooper Flagg. So not surprised. Skilled offensively, still growing into his body, can shoot the three. That could become a real weapon for him as we saw flashes this year. And I also think because of the fact that I think his potential, there's a guy with potential, then keep getting better and better and fill out, get stronger. And, 2-3 years from now, I don't want to say like Brooke Lopez, but who knows? Stanford, 7'1", who knows? He's a Lopez maybe if he fills out. By the way, you guys know this? Brooke Lopez, I think, did not shoot a three until the 8th season in his NBA career. Insane.
I did in fact know that. I've talked a few times on this podcast about my very, very first early NBA coverage days, and talking about how, Brooke Lopez is like one of the best players in the league at shooting 20-footers, and he shoots 83% from the free throw line. It's like he could take one gigantic Brooke Lopez step backwards and be a good 3-point shooter. And then almost immediately after I said that, that's basically what happened. Yeah. But I do want to go back to something you said earlier, Fran, which I think is very indicative of what's been going on with the Kings, is all of these guys are older players, right? They're not taking the chance on this guy, well, other than Acuff, obviously, but they're not necessarily taking the chance of this guy could be something 3-4 years down the line. It's like, okay, we want to get, especially with these later on picks, right? Second round picks like Raynaud, late in the first round, like Nique Clifford and Karaban, right? It's like we want to get guys who are going to come in and just be able to play relatively quickly. And that's been a lot of the success, right? Is maybe Dylan Cardwell doesn't have, the all NBA potential of, someone who's 4 or 5 years younger than him. But if you need a backup center,
he's not going to be Joel Embiid, but he's going to be able to guard Joel Embiid.
There you go.
And maybe play a lot more games.
Well, we won't touch that one, but I get it. I get where you're going.
No, I'm a huge Joel Embiid fan.
I know that. I mean, hey,
I'm not meaning that
they
to be
say
negative,
availability is the best ability. I adjust it. Reliability is the best ability. Like, it's okay to be available, but if you're not any good,
true.
But you want a guy that's reliably going to play 70+ games, which. Hopefully Joel can do that this year.
And he's looking to be in great shape and claims he's in the healthiest he's been in years.
Yeah,
we'll see.
I agree. By the way, I didn't talk about Nique Clifford. If you give me a chance, and Nick, you can certainly chime in, because I didn't really watch him as much this year, but he's a kid from right here in Colorado Springs where I live. And crazy thing about Nique is he started at Colorado where he was just okay. And then he goes and plays for Niko Medved at Colorado State, right up the road from where I live, and the rest is history. And to me, like, good team guy, jack of all trades, athletic, rangy. Not quite Tyrese Halliburton, but in that kind of range as a player. So how was he this year for the Kings? Fill me in.
So it's interesting in that a lot of the sort of gap filling stuff that he did at Colorado State was still there. The defense was a lot stronger than the offense. He started the year very cold, and then after that looked a lot better in terms of hitting his shots. It's also funny because I think Nique Clifford is the poster person for how weird Summer League can be, in that before his rookie year, he was Summer League all-first team, and this year he was nowhere near as good in Summer League, despite having, spent a year playing in the NBA on an NBA court. So that's one of those, small sample size things of Summer League where it's like, he played 5 games and maybe those were 5 not great games, and maybe he was struggling with some injury or something like that. But I think this is going to be a pivotal year for Nique because, as you mentioned, right, the Kings have a glut of guards, but they only have the 1 point. And so
Right.
the question I was having heading into Summer League was, is Nique going to be able to maybe secure that backup point guard slot? And there were definitely some ups and downs in terms of that. And so I'm going to be curious to see what his role looks like this year, because he is one of the bigger sort of combo-y guards that they have who, maybe could be more of a 3 than a 2, depending on how the roster shakes out. But certainly in terms of what he did last year, he looked ahead of the curve for a rookie defensively, which, given that almost all rookies are bad defensively their first year in the NBA, the fact that he was solid on that end was encouraging. The fact that he looked a lot better once his shots actually started falling was encouraging as well. The cold start was one of those things where, sometimes you get shooting luck early in your career, sometimes you don't. But I do think he's a better shooter than the 33% he ended up at last year. And I think the second half of the season is more indicative of the kind of shooting threat he's going to be going forward. But he's someone who has a lot of different ways to earn playing time. And the question is just how those minutes might come for him.
Well, I'd like to ask it this way. So I was very impressed with his versatility.
Yeah.
And you're each speaking to that in some way. And it strikes me that was why some people tended to overlook him a little bit, because he didn't have like a starring role or even a defined role necessarily. And we've heard people talk about, the importance of starring in your role. And it's like, to me, he's not going to be a star in the league, but he can easily be, to me, a star in his role, which is exploiting that versatility. I'm curious of what you guys think about that.
Well, Nick, we talked about the plethora of guards right now, and you just hope he has success in SAC because you guys follow the team so well. But sometimes a guy like that, because of the depth they have and got to get certain guys on the floor every night, you hope he's not lost in the shuffle. So it's incumbent upon him. And I don't, as I said earlier, I don't put too much stock in Summer League, good or bad, because Shohei Ohtani goes 0 for 4. You know what I mean? He might go 0 for 8. He might go 2 games where he's probably one of the greatest, he's going to end up being one of the greatest baseball players in history. But these great players in baseball go, 1 for 23. It happens. For Nique, from afar, 30,000 feet, I hope he has success in SAC, but he's got to prove it his second year because of the fact that there's depth in that backcourt. And sometimes a guy like that doesn't happen. It doesn't happen for him in a certain place and has to go elsewhere to find a role. But obviously, if you're a SAC fan, you don't want that to happen because, from what I know of that young man and followed him in high school and college, he is a kind of a jack of all trades. And there's nothing wrong with that because the league, and I think of guys like Torian Prince and Royce O'Neal. I can think of so many guys that come to mind that are on teams and you go, oh my God, he's still in the league. And yet, on a given night, he's a key guy for your team. Bruce Brown, when the Nuggets won the title, how important was he to that team? Jermichael Green stays in the league forever. So that's how I kind of see Nique's career, but he's got to kind of produce and show at least King fans and the Kings organization, like, I'm ready to make that next step as a second-year player.
And I can see that. I can see him having the ability to produce in a lot of different ways that will fill in where the Kings need it. And, I mean, if any team has needs, it's the Kings. And,
yes.
Being available to fulfill those roles. How many players, you named a few, but how many players have the ability to not be, pigeonholed and the ability to fill in where needed, and they need everything.
Yeah, the league is made up of those guys. I mean, like I said, there's the 25 stars, and then there's another 50 guys that, we look at as being, really, really top level NBA players, but all these teams that win games. You look at the Knicks. I mean, come on. Josh Hart is a superstar in his role.
Exactly.
And Josh has been on a number of teams, and he found a place that really valued that toughness and that grittiness. OG Anunoby is in that top tier of 26 to 75, but yet it's a Josh Hart that makes such a difference on that team to go along with the superstars like Brunson and Carl Towns. So as the Kings start to develop this winning culture that you guys are hoping for, it's not just a Darius Acuff becoming Dame Lillard, if I'm correct, and that's a little much, obviously, but it's guys that can grow into roles. It's like a Raynaud growing into a Brook Lopez type, which is very possible. So that's they're in a similar situation to the Nets, to the Wizards. I mean, they were all tanking for a reason this year.
Except the Kings refused to tank, which really
I know, it was
right.
crazy. But believe me, I was rooting for them at the end of the year because I have a son that was on another team that was, ended up working out pretty well for them. But yes, I know. I don't know. I don't know why they started winning. I don't want to get into it with you guys because
right.
I wasn't
and they were
it.
playing mostly teams that were tanking, right? It's like they were not playing anyway.
When the Pacers played the Jazz, it was ugly basketball.
It was totally ugly.
Amazing.
I wanted to ask one thing. When you were talking about Cardwell, and
yes.
Nick and I have talked about this a number of times. When you were describing, what he brings, and that's certainly going to be sufficient and necessary and useful, I keep thinking of Mitch Robinson and Time Lord in terms of they bring those same sorts of things, and they're stars in their role, and they're very important to their teams. Now, granted, they've had significant injury problems, but it strikes me that's the role that he's likely to be playing over the years.
He's off to that start, I'm telling you. And like when I said in college, I said it on the air too. I fell in love with him as a backup center in the NBA because, I spend most of my time in college basketball. Like on a given night, I'm watching Baylor, Arizona, as opposed to Nuggets, Spurs. Okay, that's just because I've got a job to do. But
right.
I have enough friends in the league. Obviously I coach guys that are in the league, played in the league, talked to people in the league to know that like having a good backup center. And the crazy thing right now with the Kings, it's almost you got a plethora of solid play at the 5 spot, with Sabonis, and now how are they going to play him with one of the other bigs, and can Max and Dylan play together? That's going to be interesting because those two young guys are probably going to be in the league a decade. And, obviously Domas has been an all-star, I think 3 times at least. And he's still kind of in the back of his prime. He's certainly not over the hill yet. And so, that's a pretty good situation to be in. And, that's a nice embarrassment of riches there's a lot of teams in the West who are really good teams, playoff teams. I mean, the Warriors would love to have that from them.
Yeah, for sure. So one other player that we wanted to have each of you talk about that came to the Kings in the offseason and had one good year up in Toronto and then a not so good year in Toronto. And
yes.
Right there. And one of the things I would add just in general is that for all the failings that the Kings have, one thing that they seem to have well is the player evaluation and scouting. And, that's led to the players we've been talking about, but Precious Achiuwa as well. But most recently, let's talk about Mogbo.
Yeah. It's funny because I told you guys earlier, I've spent a week watching the Toronto Raptors because I love the way they play defense. They play like a college team. They play like Houston, the Cougars. They really do. You look at Colin Murray-Boyles. You got Scotty Barnes, who should have been, I think, first team All NBA defense. Honestly, he was second team. No big deal, except to him. Jacoby Walter, I mentioned. They're really scrappy. Jonathan, I saw him in college, and I thought he was like high energy, underskilled, which is not a negative. High energy, 6'9", underskilled, knows his role, going to play hard, compete, rebound, loose balls, etc. I'm guessing what happened, and this is just a guess, that this year in Toronto, he just got pushed out of the rotation. Because you mentioned, Ray, the first year he had a really good rookie season as I think the 31st pick, if I'm not mistaken. And I remember watching him in college, And again, in college, he's kind of under the radar because you got St. Mary's and Gonzaga. And I think it's probably a good pickup for the Kings because getting back to what I said about, Nique Clifford, sometimes you just can't get on the court because they've got guys at your spot. So when I watched the Raptors this week, I didn't see him out there a lot. And I don't think he played much. I think he averaged under 2 points a game. And I just think maybe what happened was he got lost in the shuffle. Because, again, they had an elite defense and they won 46 games. So, that's a guy that you take a flyer on. And I think he got a two-way deal, if I'm not mistaken.
He did.
Right? So he's a low-risk, high-reward guy. And he could become that energizer bunny off the bench, kind of the way he was as a rookie in Toronto. So my gut feeling with him is that he probably just couldn't get on the court because they had so many guys. And now they just drafted Alan Graves from Santa Clara, who fits in with them like a glove because he's kind of your ultimate glue guy. That Raptors team is a bunch of glue guys. And so I'm sure there was no room for him this year. And so he gets a fresh start, closer to where he went to college.
Yeah.
Hey, Nick, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on him because I know you studied him as well in the past.
Yeah, I was a huge fan of his coming out of college. And it's one of those things where, the role that he would in theory fill in Sacramento is pretty clear of, as you mentioned, high energy guy with size that the Kings have desperately needed, but a much better athlete than Karaban, right? So can cover a lot more ground in sort of, the kind of more free safety forward defensive role, for him. In terms of the offensive stuff, I mean, I'm guessing that a lot of what he's going to be doing is just throwing down lobs. He tried to shoot threes his first year in Toronto. He shot 24%. That's not particularly part of his game. He's also, not the best free throw shooter. He did shoot 73% his first year. That was a bit of a dip last year, but, not Dylan Cardwell level of, sub 50 3-point free throw shooting, excuse me. But, he doesn't have much stretch to his game. He is, I think, a really good passer, especially for his position. And I think that, comes into play with what we're talking about with Karaban earlier of the connective passing, right? He's not someone who's going to have the ball in his hands very much, but when he does, he does have a tendency to make, I would say, surprising levels of reads that maybe you wouldn't expect for someone with the rest of his offensive skill set. But ultimately, I think it's going to be one of those things where, again, something that Ray and I talked about to death last year was the fact that outside of Keegan Murray, the Kings didn't really have versatile defensive forwards. And if Mogbo can be that on one end and just make good decisions offensively, throw down lobs, make good passes, not shoot stupid shots, then I think there's a very clear path for him to get that two-way contract converted pretty quickly because, again, he can, in theory, and has in the past, provide a lot of things that the Kings would need from someone like him.
Yeah, and as I recall, and I really don't remember much from San Francisco, I remember studying him, but as I recall, at 6'8" or 6'9", they really allowed him to do a lot of things. He was like a super glue guy at San Francisco where he did handle the ball in the open, rebound, rip and run and go. And so, because I actually remember thinking he was 6'6", but he's really 6'8" or 6'9". And so I saw some of those skills that you talked about. So it's a fresh start for him. He's a young guy. And again, the Kings building, some sort of culture, hopefully, with these young players who come from winning programs. And you also hope that because he was well coached in Toronto, being around guys like Scotty Barnes, that he'll bring some of that, to Sac because again, they're building a nice culture in Toronto with the Raptors.
I think that what we can best take from this discussion is, I'll say on the one hand and on the other. On the one hand, for 2 consecutive seasons, the Kings have done a terrific job in acquiring young players and draftees and undrafted free agents and other types of free agents, etc. The people should be enthused and excited about that as Kings fans. On the other hand, be realistic. They've got an over-under of 21.5. Okay, so it's not happening overnight. And, the competition is just amazing and incredible who you play every
Yes.
It's going to take time. It's going to take patience. It's going to take not skipping steps. And that you have this great scouting and player evaluation staff. Hey, rely on them to keep adding year after year, and don't be panicked to the point where you make a crazy deviation from your plan. That would be my take.
I agree. I think they've done well. These last 2 years. It's I keep thinking about Luka Doncic and Marvin Bagley, and I know that's a sore spot.
Yeah.
Um, but this is a good start, and I think the key for this group, these first and second year guys, is Darius Acuff becoming what I think he could be, which would be a reasonable facsimile of Dame Lillard. Who's one of the great players, probably I got to think, Ray, he's top 75 all time. He is, right, and we'll see how he comes back this year from the Achilles. But if he could be in that ballpark in year 3, on his way to being a near all-star, being 22 points a game, 8 assists, that kind of player, which I think it's very reasonable. I'll be interested to go back on the show with you guys next spring to see if he gets 40 in a game, because I kind of feel there's going to be a night
in our notes.
Yeah, no, I'm okay with saying it, because he's got that kind of ability. And see, what people don't realize who follow college basketball is there's 70 possessions in a college game. There's over 100 in an NBA game. And there's going to be nights where he's going to have to be prolific.
Yeah. There's going to be a lot of nights
some nights
have to be prolific.
Yeah. Some nights he's going to be prolific, Nick, and it's going to be 5 for 22, okay? And that's going to happen. But there's going to be a night where he goes 15 for 23, 7 threes, 11 for 12 from the line, and 6 assists. And you're going to go, holy crap! I'm going to be in Norman, Oklahoma, or Lawrence, Kansas one night, looking at my phone, going, "Wow, man, Acuff got 41 tonight."
Just like I said he would.
Just like I predicted. So we'll see. But I think it's a good start, especially when Kings fans have been desperate for something like this.
So before I wind up by showing our appreciation, I'm going to ask each of you if there's anything you want to additionally tell us that we didn't cover, and then we can do our...
Well, I'll start, Nick, and then you'll end it. You'll end this great podcast. But Ray, we'll let your listeners know that you and I are going to be back at this in the fall, because I've got a book coming out called Don't Mess with Happy. And it's 23 years as a coach, 23 years as a broadcaster, incredible stories. Brent
What's
Musburger.
going to be the best way to get to get the book?
Well, it'll be out. We'll figure out. It's going to be at Amazon, Barnes and Noble. Our publisher is Storyteller Publishing out of Kansas City, but we'll get to that point in the fall. But we hope to have the book out in mid-October, and just tons of stories, and actually a lot of lessons too, from my years as a coach. And it's a great book for basketball junkies. There's a lot of stuff about how to get into broadcasting. I help young broadcasters. I think I help young coaches, and so many good lessons and stories. And
I need to know as soon as possible what day that is, because I know I'm going to read it in one sitting, and so I have to dedicate that day.
It's funny, the back jacket, my blurbs, my quotes from people I trust and admire. We've got Brent Musburger, Jay Wright, and 6-time New York Times bestselling author Ian O'Connor, who's who's a great friend who helped me quite a bit with the book. So anyway, that's my 2 cents. We'll talk more about that in the fall. We'll let Nick close this podcast out.
Well, I will try and worm my way into that conversation. If I will at least be producing it, that's for sure. But yeah, just first of all, thank you so much for being so generous with your time, for talking through all of the young players for the Kings. And yeah, it's one of those things where maybe the Kings are sort of looking at the bottom, looking up in terms of, where they're going to be probably in the league standings for at least a little bit going forward. But you have to start with the foundation, right? And certainly the foundation that they've been laying over the past 2 years has been about as good as anybody could have hoped for, given the picks they entered with for the last two drafts.
So I'm just going to wind this up by giving my thanks and appreciation to each of you. Nick, as always, and Fran, as always. You guys were just amazing and incredible, and sure that everyone in our audience learned a lot. So thank you so much. Much appreciated.
My pleasure, Ray. Nick, great being on with you. We'll catch up in a few weeks or months.
All right. So thank you all so much for listening. And thank you, of course, to Fran for joining us. You can find his work on ESPN and his upcoming book, which we will be sure to discuss at some point in the weeks and months ahead. As mentioned up top, we are part of the Believe Network, which you can find on social media at BLEAV. We are part of the Basketball Intelligence Network, which you can find on social media at Ticket Rules. We are part of the Old Man Squad Network, which you can find on social media at Old Man Squad. And you can find us at Kings Weekly Pod on Twitter, at Kings Weekly Podcast on Blue Sky. We will have a few more off-season pods coming up, so be sure to be on the lookout for that as the ramp up to training camp and the start of the season begins. But that will do it for us today. If you've been enjoying the show, please be sure to leave a rating and or a review in whatever podcast player you might be using. And be sure to like and subscribe on YouTube. And to all of you, thanks so much for listening.